try to shut us down. I'll be damned if we gon' let them take back the night. Alright, take back the night. You know you gon' mess around and find out there ain't no one better. And the horse say, alright. And the horse say, and the horse say, feels good to me. And the horse say, alright, ooh, it's taking over.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, and welcome to the session on unlocking the decision matrix, support your decision, and robust cost analytics. My name is Sue Khwaja, and I'm the Business Development Manager here at IMA, and I will be your moderator for today's session. Just a reminder, all attendees who are seeking CPE credit must have their name badge scanned as they're coming into and out of the session. And for our virtual attendees, you must watch the session for the entire time to receive your CPE credit. You can submit the questions for the speaker today through the app and upvote any of the questions you like in the app or through the virtual platform. So with that, let me introduce our speaker. As the president and CEO of 3C Software, Matthew Smith sets the strategic direction on the organization. With nearly 30 years of progressive experience as a leader and innovator, Matthew has been actively involved in all areas of business, including professional services, sales and marketing, support, and strategic planning. Matthew is consistently recognized for his expertise in developing and implementing enterprise cost and profitability systems. An alumnus of West Georgia College, Matthew infuses 3C with his own brand of passion around the ideas and technologies that help businesses make better and more informed decisions. Please welcome Matthew Smith.
Thanks, Sue. Welcome, everybody. IMA 22, live and in person, right? How many of you, this is your first conference you've attended live since the craziness? Yeah, I'm just ahead of you, but only by about 3 weeks. 3 weeks ago, I got to be in Australia for a conference that was part of the Meat Processors and Grocery Council. So lucky me, my first two conferences out of the pandemic, I get to wear boots and jeans to both of them, right? So both of them were accounting related, so I never would have guessed. I'd have had dress slacks and maybe a suit on, but between Austin and Australia beef industry, you had to wear boots and jeans. So I'm glad to be here today, and I'm glad for you guys to have me here. I want to point out, Sue mentioned it, but we have not only you guys in the room, but we have just over 100 people that are signed in online, so we've got a good audience, good participation. But again, I'm super psyched to be back face-to-face. And the JW Marriott, right? Better than my basement or my guest room or the coffee shop, right? You couldn't go wrong with that. Those of you that are attending virtually, it's really terrible here. You wouldn't like it anyway. You're not missing anything. It's way too hot unless you're in the swimming pool, so you're not missing anything, and glad you could at least join us virtually. As Sue said, my name is Matthew Smith. I'm the president and CEO of a cost and profitability software and consulting firm. It's what my expertise is in. I've been building costing and profitability models for, I don't like when you say 30 years. You should just say kind of a long time. It's not comfortable when I hear you say that. I work a lot with manufacturing companies and manufacturing and distribution companies. Sometimes that's one and the same where they're manufacturing and putting it in their distribution networks, and sometimes it's just distribution companies. Not a whole lot of work with service organizations, but I have done some spotty stuff here and there, activity-based costing and cost to serve and some stuff like that, right? My discussion today is going to be on the topic of decision-making, and more specifically, decision-making with the support of robust cost and profitability modeling and the data that comes out of that, as you might have missed. But I'm going to give you a little bit of a disclosure here. There might even be somebody in the room that can help me along the way. I'm not an expert in the science of decision-making, right? When I got into this topic and said, all right, this will be good for not only general knowledge, because we talk about accounting stuffs all the time, but this will be a little bit outside the box and good for CPE credits and all those other things. I started doing a little bit of research, it was probably 3 months ago, and I found there is a science and a world like there is to anything in decision making, right? I mean, they're absolute experts, and that's not me here today. But I am very interested in the topic because a lot of the data that we create in our day-to-day jobs, me and my organization, probably a lot of you, that data feeds into people in our organization and even ourselves that are making real critical decisions, right? So learning, or sitting through a session like this and learning a bit about a formalized decision-making process and what it means and what it's all about, what I realized is I've made a lot of decisions for a long time and somewhat followed a framework, but I didn't really know I was following a framework, right? And I'm sure it led me astray at times and just got lucky other times, right? So we're going to talk a lot about decision-making, and but we're going to learn a lot along the way, and you guys can contribute as well, right? All right, let me get going with my clickers and all my good stuff here. Perfect. I'm going to start today talking about the current challenges we're facing, because those challenges are what driving all the decisions that we're going to have to make and how these challenges might affect the different decision making. Then we'll tie that into the process of establishing a robust, what we call fact-based cost and profit decision making process. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about something called the decision matrix. That's a little bit where the science comes in, the process and the matrix. And I'll show you some examples of how to use this matrix and these processes in our day-to-day decision making, right? But let's start with something a little more fun. Let's start with a quote from our 26th president. I had to look that up, Teddy Roosevelt, right? In any moment of decision, the best thing you can do is the right thing. The next best thing is the wrong thing, and the worst thing you can do is nothing. That's quite bold, right? That sounds awfully confident to me, but I can tell you, it's not always to be this decisive, right? Especially over the past 2 years when it seems the facts that we're given seem to change every day on us, right? You get new input data almost every day, so how in the world can you be this decisive today and tomorrow that was the wrong answer, right? But I do like the spirit of the quote. It's a kind of a call to action to do something, right? Hopefully what we talk about today will equip you guys with some tools to help you practice this level of confidence, if that's what you want to call it, braveness in your decision-making stuff, right? Let's talk about what's happened, right? You can't come back from the pandemic and do a conference without talking about what's happening, so I've got some facts I want to share with you, and it'll set the stage for our decision-making. For the past 2 years, we've faced quite a bit of stuff, right? Ernst & Young, EY, recently released a post-pandemic survey that showed almost 40% of us have experienced significant short-term disruption in our industry. I got to be honest with you, that feels awfully low to me, right? If I said to this audience, how many of you experienced short-term disruption in the past 2 years to your business? Certainly more than 40% of you would raise your hand, right? Right? Quick test. Right? Even the nods, right? It's got to be more than 40%, right? Maybe people are still in shock, or they're not answering, or they're not wanting to be truthful or something like that, right? Certainly, even in my organization, I saw some very serious disruptions. Before the pandemic, I have a whole slew of consultants that were out on the road. They were at client sites. They were doing software implementations. They were doing cost studies on the site at least Monday through Thursday, sometimes half a day Friday, classic consulting life. That came to an abrupt halt, you can imagine, right? So that's our operations delivery part of our business. We even had business development, right? These are like inside sales business development people who their whole job was sitting at an office and picking up the phone and calling people who were sitting at their desk, answering their phone, trying to get engaged, Well, you know what happened immediately, right? No one's sitting at their desk and certainly no one's answering their phones, right? So that part of our business was quite disrupted, right? And then even our sales and solutions teams, they're used to traveling, doing demos like this in front of audiences, right? Going into companies, investigating solutions and pursuing business. That came to a grinding halt. So in the three major areas of our business, the delivery and then the attempts to get to the delivery, the sales and lead gen areas, complete disruption even in my organization, right? So I know it happened in other organizations as well, right? For just over 20% of those that were surveyed by EY, their industry has been fundamentally reshaped for the worse, right? This is probably the worst case scenario, right? And hopefully not many of you in here are there. I have a good friend in Atlanta, Georgia, that's where I'm here from, who's in the commercial office space leasing business. And when I tell you this guy was a high roller, I loved the guy to death. High roller, had a Rolodex anytime. I mean, he knew when every lease was going to expire and was there 6 months early, had made a real profession of this. He's in that 20%. His business is disrupted for the worse, right? So not good, but there are lots of examples like that. I like to think for a minute, and I've had a couple of discussions around this about what I used to complain about all the time. Remember that horrible, well, I'm from Atlanta, so you'll appreciate it. Remember that horrible commute you used to have into the office? That was the number one complaint I had, right? Or somebody left the coffee pot empty, or this was my favorite one, and I miss these days. I'd walk up to the conference room, but the crowd that was in there before me, they were 5 minutes over, and I couldn't get in and get set up, right? So you're pacing outside in the hallway, waiting on them to get out. They come out, you're cursing under your breath, but you're smiling. I'm no problem, right? Oh, and then I do the same thing to the next group because I'm running late, right? And that was the big problem of the day, right? Boy, do I miss those days. That disappeared instantly, right? So seriously, some disruptions have happened, right? 15% of the survey respondents recognize that the pandemic accelerated an existing trend. What is that? We all know what that existing trend that was just emerging. It was being driven by the new members of the workforce, primarily the 22 to 25-year-olds. You want to take a guess what it was? You got it. Work from anywhere, right? Boy, did that accelerate, right? If you were in the right place at the right time, maybe you were an early investor in Zoom, right? I don't know if you'd be sitting here if you were an early investor in Zoom, quite candidly. You might be out at the pool, but you might not be sitting in here getting your CPE credits. I watch that company. I'm a partner with them, and we use them in our companies, and I had a couple of guys in that organization that I got close to. Crazy, crazy days in a business like that, right? So certainly they were affected, not for the worse, but for the better, but had their fair share of growing pains for sure, right? But that seems to be a trend that isn't going away. Quick show of hands. Do you see this remote work being around more permanently than it was before in your business? Without a doubt, right? Everybody I talk to, there's talk of coming back, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, but it seems like it's here to stay. And I don't think the pandemic caused it, I think it accelerated it, right? Which is what the survey said. We were already headed that way. I have a 25-year-old son who's out of college and in the workforce, and he's certainly, I used to watch it all the time, certainly that way. I'd catch him in the middle of the day, with gym shorts on. I said, what, are you not working today? So yeah, I've been working all morning, right? So it took me a minute to catch up. But now I'm appreciating it myself, right? Sitting at home, not having to get up and do the coffee pot empty and the traffic and all the other things we complained about. So that's going to be around to stay for a while. And then finally, the others that responded here fell into a couple of categories. Either had no negative impact, kind of neutral once they got over the immediate shock, or there's some industries that have been reshaped for the better, right? So I want to see a show of hands in three broad categories. I'll tell you what they're going to be so you know where to vote for yourself. But there are industries that are reshaped for the better, some that had little to no effect, and some that were reshaped for the worse. How many of you are in the better boat? Your industry's been reshaped for the better because of what we've been through in the pandemic. Oh, that's promising. Yeah, that's good. How about little to no impact other than immediate shock and maybe the place you're working, but business itself is pretty usual? All right, so what scares me is there are a lot of hands that haven't been raised, which means how many of you think your industry's been infected for the worse? Yeah, that's the stories to go get told and to listen to and to focus on right there, right? That's a tough one. Anybody have an example they want to share with us? It's always fun if I'm not the only one talking the whole time. Somebody with the worst, brave enough to share with us what happened that made it worse? No? No one's going to jump in? All right, fair enough. Let's talk for a minute about, did you find somebody?
Yep.
Oh, you did. Good. I promise you this is most interesting for everybody in the room, including me.
Well, okay, I'm in higher education, and so when all of a sudden colleges went from in-person to remote, and then students said, and their parents said, why am I paying this money for the college experience, however you want to define that college experience, when they're sitting home? And also as a professor, and I'm sure people at the elementary level and high school level say the same thing, the interaction with the students is just not the same. And so you really can't get things across. And unfortunately, I'm not sure that that's going to be going away. So I don't think that the online educational environment is as good as the in-person, but I don't think it's going to be going away completely. So I think that's a change for the worse.
Yeah, that's unfortunate because it's such an important segment or business in our economy, right? Educating the young people. I talked about having a 25-year-old who was out in the workforce, but what I didn't tell you is my younger son graduated high school in May of 2020, if you want to call it graduation. Maybe some of you had kids in the same boat, right? He graduated from his bedroom upstairs on a Zoom meeting. And then I sent him off to the College of Charleston that fall. Fortunately, they accepted him, right? To your point, we didn't sit him at home because I think at 18, me, him, and his mother, my wife, still in the house, it was time to go, right? So that age I've decided is the perfect one to send him off for lots of reasons. But we had worked hard getting him ready to go off that August, and just the thought of him spending the next semester upstairs was, nobody wanted to mention it at all, right? So yeah, I felt your pain. I lived through it. Fortunately, he got moved in. They did an interesting thing. Maybe you, your college did the same thing, or the organization you're in did the same thing, is they actually moved him into a dorm. This is August of 2020. And had them sit in that dorm and take all their classes online. Same tuition, same room and board, same meal plan, same everything, but I was not complaining. He was not upstairs like he was the last half of his senior year. He was over in Charleston. We were in Atlanta, so I'm not complaining at all. But yeah, I appreciate your example. That's a good one. Thanks for interjecting. All right, so now that it seems we seem to be coming out of the pandemic, I'm not going to start any political arguments or say we are where we are in it, but it feels like we're coming out of it a little bit, and at least we've had chances to kind of respond and find some sort of new normal. So I want to recognize for a moment where we might be in that experience. I found this very interesting when I found it. It was produced by Gartner. They've done extensive research on pandemic response. And they see companies responding in 3 phases, and the duration of each of these phases vary by region of the world or country even, by industry, by enterprise, and even within the same company by business unit or product or service line, right? They've seen the responses quite different depending on what the item is, right? They point out in the survey and the data that went along with it that at any given point, while you might be in a single stage, you're really overlapping into the next stage as well, which their diagram represents here, because what you're learning and what you're going through becomes the foundation for the next stage, right? And I thought these 3 phases were kind of worth mentioning so we could all reflect on where we might be on each of them, right? The first one is, and by the way, their names give away exactly what they are. I like how straightforward they were when they named this thing. The respond phase is all about immediate actions focused on keeping people safe, in this particular case, the pandemic, right? And keeping essential business functions operating, right? It's usually a relatively short period of time. It's marked by high effort, oftentimes chaotic activity, is the way they describe this phase. And the key activities are always viewed as kind of temporary, just 2 weeks, guys, that's all we need. To stop the bleeding, work from home was a great example, right? That was the immediate thing, at least we did in my company, and I saw clients do. They say, let's try to keep doing our job, but just do it from somewhere else, right? That was the first immediate thing we did, and that was a good example of something that happened in the respond phase. The next thing that happened is the recovery phase, right? It's represented by more organized, coordinated efforts to stabilize the operations as we now see them emerging, is the way they describe it. The phase is typically of medium duration, and the key activities include things like reopening, right? A lot of businesses just closed down. That wasn't my business. We didn't close down all the way, but reopening was a big thing for a lot. Restoring a scalable state, identifying the capabilities that you need to strengthen or add. You had to rehire, refactor, rebudget for sure, right? That was a big thing for a lot of my clients was, hey, now that everything's changed, let's try to re-roll budgets in the middle of this and see what we're going to spend and what our forecasted profits are going to be. So that was the recover phase. And then finally, the renew phase. Hopefully, many of us are into this now. I feel like it's where I am with my company. It's an extended period of time. It doesn't go on forever because at some point it just becomes the norm and you wait for the next disruption to happen and you get right back in the respond phase again, right? But the renew phase is where Key activities are things like you learn to conduct operations, processes, and workflows in new ways. You become more scalable, more reliable. You just get more comfortable and better at doing it. If you just take the remote work issue alone that we talked about before, I can picture how we went through all three of these, but I didn't realize it at the time, right? It was immediate, it was fast, everybody was just on their notebooks. Then before you knew it, people had swung by the office and swiped monitors off of desks and even taken fancy chairs home and all that sort of stuff. And now when people log in, I see they've got entire rooms in their basement finished and dedicated now, right? So now it's a new thing. They've got office space dedicated, and they're just off to the races like it never happened, and not to look back from it becomes the new norm, right? So it's interesting to me, maybe you can think about where you are in each of these phases and kind of where you hope to be and what you might have coming towards you if you're not at the end yet. So now let's talk a little bit about decisions, right? If that's what's happened to us, right? That has driven a ton of decisions, right? So on top of the pandemic, let's remind ourselves, because that's forefront, we had an extremely challenging election cycle. We have a war going, full-scale war going on in Europe, right, which hasn't happened for quite a while. And now the financial fallout from all three of these things seems to be gaining momentum. I certainly don't want to wish that or hope for that, but it certainly feels like that's what's going on. So needless to say, there's a lot going on, right? Strategic Finance Magazine recently reported the top issues facing CFOs in mid-sized to large organizations. These were the top issues keeping these CFOs up at night, and see how many of them might sound familiar to you. Of course, number one, inflation. Workforce, that's people, right? Human resources, people to do the jobs. Supply chain, I mean, that was a word that I knew very well because I do costing work up and down the supply chain, and now my wife's talking about it when we have people over for dinner, right? I mean, it's just crazy to me how involved in supply chain we've all become all of a sudden, right? Energy and geopolitics, that rounds out the top of the list, and there are a couple more. To me, it just sounds like the evening news, right? You watch any episode of the evening news, any network, and those issues get touched on, right? So there's significant challenges that we're facing on and significant decisions that have to be made, which hopefully this framework will help you with. Let's tie this a little bit to cost and profitability. This to me is exciting news actually because it's the business I'm in, right? As we're working on all of these decisions, organizations have reported, right? And they reported this in Deloitte's Global Cost Management Survey. I'm a cost nerd, so I follow this thing every year. Deloitte does a good job of doing a global sort of state of costing. They do a survey. It's very well participated, very high number, so the data comes out that's pretty accurate, and I've followed it for years, right? And what's exciting to me is that cost, and more importantly, cost reduction, is a top priority for most all organizations. I mean, if you look across the board at these percentages, they're way up there, and I'll kind of contrast them with what they were when they did the survey in 2019, and it's pretty dramatic, right? The prevailing mindset relative to strategic cost management was really what they classified as save to transform. People were going through sort of a digital transformation. We're going to get better. They're moving kind of slow. They're improving processes. Maybe they had ERP upgrade projects going on. They're moving to the cloud as a technology strategy. So there was just this sort of, hey, we're going to save money by slowly transforming and improving the business, right? That got thrown out the window because it wasn't fast enough. What they're doing now and what they're calling it is save to survive or save to thrive, right? One or the other. Either the cost reductions and the savings have to be there to survive the business, or, hey, this is a real opportunity for us. If we do it right, we can thrive in this particular environment. So the save to thrive shows that companies are racing to capitalize on the new norm, moving faster than before. Let's take a look at each one of these responses and the decisions and how these are related to structures. Let's look at number one. There's certainly an increased focus on cost reduction. Relative to pre-pandemic levels, the likelihood of undertaking cost reduction initiatives increased globally 74%, right? 28 percentage points. So that 66% you see there was 28 points lower in 2019 than it is now. And that's globally companies that are currently undertaking cost reduction initiatives, right? 2 of 3 companies globally, 66%, now expect to pursue cost reduction strategies over the next 12 months. That, again, if you're a costing nerd like me, that's kind of exciting. I don't know where we're going to take the cost out of the businesses, quite candidly, right? If in 2019 you asked me how competitive we were cost-wise, and most Fortune 1,500, even 5,000 organizations were pretty competitive. But if you're going to go find more, that's going to be interesting. We've got to find new ways to do things. This one is really interesting to me. The number one internal challenge faced by most respondents in this survey is the inability to adjust the cost structure to meet the new demand. And in most cases, unfortunately, that was lower demand, right? Could have been higher for some, but in most cases it was lower demand. But a fixed internal cost structure that couldn't be modified quick enough to match that demand was the number one internal challenge that these respondents referred to. It used to be, every year it was always employee safety, right? A lot of manufacturers respond to this, so employee safety is always number one. And I always looked at that and said, yeah, you always say employee safety. What's really number two was really number one, right? But number two was always the need to increase satisfied demand, right? We're sitting around worried about, hey, we're going to get all this new business. How are we going to ramp up? How are we going to increase demand? How are we going to grow, right? To immediately, a year and a half later, the same survey says, hey, we can't cut our cost structure quick enough, right, to meet demand. So we're really bloated. That's going to be very interesting to see how companies address that and some of the decisions that are going to be made out of it, right? If you turn to external challenges, of course, supply chain ranked as the number one concern. Dropping consumer demand was a close number two, shifting consumer behavior, and then cybersecurity vulnerabilities popped up on the survey where it used to be very low ranking, but it came in at like 65% now as a concern, right? So if you look at it, this particular one was, same. So 65% for cybersecurity and 65% for global supply chain, right? So that's interesting to me that that's popped up in this time as such a strategic external challenge, right? And then finally, it's reported through the survey that 2 out of 3 companies, this is a number that's incredible to me, are chasing cost reductions of greater than 10%, right? I said earlier, where is the money going to come from? I mean, that's a significant amount of money to take out of most organizations without fundamentally reshaping it, but companies are chasing globally. This isn't just in the U.S. In fact, in the U.S., it was only 59% of the respondents, so quite a bit lower. In countries like Latin America, it was high as 83% of the companies responding that they had to chase reductions of 10% or greater, right? So it's going to be challenging times. Lots of decisions to be made to accomplish that if that's what they're going to do. So here's where we stand. There are a lot of important decisions to be made right now, and they'll continue to be made over the next couple of years, but sadly it turns out we're not very good at it. That's what I learned when I got into this rabbit hole and studied decision making, is that McKinsey, who's one of the companies that has a big science around decision making, they wrote an interesting article that was very insightful to me called Decision Making in the Age of Urgency. And what they report in that is of all their client companies, which if you know McKinsey, you're talking about some pretty highbrow organizations that are pretty mature and you think they have most things squared away, 20% of them reported they were good at decision making. This is self-evaluation, only 20% of them, which of course a whopping 80% believe they're not very good at decision making and they didn't have a formal process in place. So here we are at a point in time where we're faced with arguably the most drastic decisions in the past decade, for sure. You could probably argue 20 years, but somehow remind me of something that happened 20 years ago. Yet we're still not good at it, or we stink at it, right? The truth is, the reason is because most companies do not have a decision-making framework formalized that guides their decision-making process, right? But it's obvious from this data that McKinsey reports on that it certainly is of value. I'll share with you sort of what this chart means. Organizations that do have a clear decision-making process are almost 7 times better at making decisions at the appropriate level within the organization. That's one of the characteristics of good decision-making processes is, do you make the decision at the right level in the organization, or do you involve too many people higher up, which is a waste of resources, or too fewer people, which jeopardizes the decision that's being made, right? But again, those that have a clear process and do that are 7 times better than their peers at doing the same thing. Organizations that have a clear process are also 3 times better at making decisions that align with their corporate strategies and that allocate resources to the right high-value projects, right? And then finally, organizations with a clear decision-making process are almost 7 times better at committing to decisions once they're made. Just the process of having the formal framework that we work through to make the decision makes the decision stick better, it's been proven, right? So just having the process, involving the right people, and knowing that you went through the steps, the number one thing it did with the people involved, if they're all following the process, is it gets buy-in. And it's that buy-in that gets the decision to stick at the end of the day, right? So overall, collectively, companies that have a clear decision-making process are 38 times better when they have all 3 of these elements in their process. And that's quite a competitive advantage, right? If you're a Fortune 5,000 company, I mean, you're 38 times better at making strategic decisions than your nearest competitor, you're doing pretty good in that area, right? That was compelling to me. Very interesting data. It was decision-making in the age of urgency. It was quite entertaining, even by McKinsey standards, which tend to be a bit dry at times if you read them like I do. I was going to move on, but let's wait for just a minute. Thoughts on this? I'm going to get you guys to participate a little bit, or maybe comments on where you might be, right? Let's do this. How many of you feel like your organization has a formalized decision-making process? That's good. We got a few hands. Yep. Good. I'm going to assume the rest of you, the answer is no, you don't have a formal decision-making process, so we don't have to raise our hands, the rest of us. My company certainly did not. I thought we did. We all got together, talked about the options, decided, and went on about our way, but we fell short in many areas, right? But that's good. So small number of people here, maybe those that are online, the numbers are a little bit higher. Why aren't we good at, or why don't we have processes is the next thing I'm going to talk about. Why is it so hard to make decisions, right? There are lots of studies on them, but most of them narrow down the challenges to some form of these 6 issues, right? Speed and timing of the decision, right? Sometimes we make the decision, but we make it too soon, ill-informed from the gut, and it was the wrong decision, or we make it too late and we missed the opportunity because we were paralyzed by analysis and we overanalyzed everything and we didn't make the decision at the right time. So speed and timing, which I'm going to touch on in another minute on a slide because I think it's quite interesting to me, is number one problem or challenge with making decisions. Too much or not enough information, that goes right in hand with timing. Misidentifying the underlying problem. Right? That tends to be a big contributor towards poor decision making, is not really getting to the root problem and making a decision about something that's just off center of what the real issue that needed to be decided was. No viable alternatives or options. That was one of the concerns and one of the challenges. This was a big one to me. Opinions confused with facts. No real objectivity, which to me means there was probably no real facts that were presented, right? Because most normal people, if you present them with a clear set of facts, normal people, we're in sort of silly times these days it seems, but most people presented with the right set of facts will try to make the right decision following those facts. But opinions are often confused with facts and there's very little objectivity without a formal process in place. And then the other one is that the issue is not a one-off. A lot of times something happens and a decision needs to be made, but we just kind of brush it off. Oh, that doesn't happen very often. We don't need to worry about that, right? We see that a lot in the cost study work that I do, right? We go walk through a distribution center and you see people putting stuff off to the side or caging something up or doing some activity that to me as a cost guy knows out of the normal process, and they're doing it as there's some reason they're doing that, right? And you go investigate it and sure enough, yeah, we have this one customer, I know what's going to happen, this one order is going to come and I'm going to have to grab it, and if we don't get it out the door, this happens and that happens. So they've built this sort of what they think is a one-off thing that they're doing, but it's not, right? So they just brush it off and never make a decision around it, never formalize the process. But in reality, it's the norm, and you're doing it all the time, but it started as a one-off exercise, right? So that's the other thing. People will recognize the challenge or the decision needs to be made as a one-off and ignore it, and in fact, it's there to stay, right? So now let's move to the decision method, right? It's probably not going to share you, or surprise you, I should say, that process and framework are part of the things. Anything I've studied for the last 10 years, you got to have a process around it. That's what we preach to our people, and that's what I believe in. So what it does take is a very well-documented process, of which there are several, we're going to talk about them. And then there are several well-recognized frameworks that can help the process and help you organize the level of importance of the decision, and then who to assign to it, what resources to assign, and what the likely outcomes are going to affect, what part of the organization, right? And we'll talk about that in the decision matrix in a minute. Let's start with the process. This comes out of UMass Dartmouth, which is an organization, a partnership of UMass and Dartmouth. And they published this particular process. And when they first published or first fine-tuned it, they did it for students of theirs who were trying to decide what majors to chase. That's how it all started, right? And how they still use it today and how they refine it. Now they have a whole science in that school around this decision-making process. And this was one version of it, and they've got several versions of it for different types of decisions that have been made. But it's made up of 6 primary steps, and then there's a 7th step, which is really measuring the outcome and reevaluating, right? So 7 steps in all, but 6 primary steps to get the decision. They're going to identify the decision. Remember, one of the challenges was misidentifying the core decision that needs to be made. That was one of the challenges, so identifying the right decision that needs to be made. Gather the relevant information, facts that can support the pros and cons of the outcomes of the decision, not just opinions. 3, they're going to identify the alternative actions. You need to give yourself choices. That's something that we don't do very often when we're making decisions. We focus just on, hey, we need to decide to do this or not. And we don't really look slight left, slight right is what they recognized here. So identifying alternative actions is a very important step. Weighing the evidence objectively, we talked about that, separating the facts from the opinions. Then choose among the alternatives and make the decision. And then once you take the decision, take action, implement it, enforce it, do it, follow it, stick to it. And then finally, 7, measure the outcome and the consequences. Was the outcome as we expected? Was it a good decision? Sounds simple, right? We're going to get deeper into each step. But if you think about just everyday decisions that you make, you might go through I'll say 6. I don't often slow down and review unless somebody points it out to me how I messed up later. But everyday decisions that I make all the time, I probably run through these 6 steps just in a matter of minutes, right? Sometimes more formal decisions. I mean, I sent a kid off to college and decided what to do. We probably went through these steps at the same time, right? We did some things inside our company with work from home. We went through these steps. We didn't have this as a process, but when I reflect on it, we went through most of these steps, and I can tell you exactly where we fell down. Identify alternatives. That was something that I was personally not very good at. We would have a decision to make. This is what we're focused on, and no one would step back and say, whoa, what else could we do, right? What's the alternatives here? I think that's an important one. And then probably taking action, sticking to it, making a decision and sticking to it with everybody bought in and enforcing it and running with it was another one that we were probably weak at. In our organization, we thought we were all on the same page, sort of, kind of, but we didn't have a process to enforce it, right? So I'm going to walk through each of these steps and give you some real concrete examples from my business, and maybe you can apply some of them to yours, right? Step 1 is identify the decision. The blocks that you see here on the screen, they're taken from the work that I do at 3C Software, and I invite you to adopt them if they're helpful to you. You could get a copy of this for sure. And we use these as we're moving into organizations to try to figure out where it is we're going to focus and where we're going to try to tackle some sort of problem they presented to us, right? Let me give you an example. Let's say we're asked to help a company improve individual product or product line profitability. They've got a particular product or a product line that they've determined is not performing as it should, and they're thinking of exiting the business, right? Pre-pandemic, I met with some large pulp and paper manufacturers who were considering exiting the packaging business. Does anybody know what the packaging business did in 2020 and 2021? You can imagine, right? Through the roof, right? And 2015, 16, 17, 18, we're going to transition. Tissue's where it's at. Packaging's on the way out. We compete with the films and plastics guys. And now you cannot build box plants fast enough right now today, right? Just crazy on a dime how a business like that. And when I tell you pulp and paper, and particular linerboard that goes into packaging, that's an antiquated, old, heavy capital, not sexy industry to be in, right? A lot of people exited that business over the all of the 2000s before the pandemic, right? And now it's just as hot as it could be, right? So if you're talking about a manufactured product, right, when we'll use this, if it's a manufactured product, and I'll tell you some other cases that we'll use it where it's not manufactured. There are a lot of places where expected margin, that's the performance of the product, could be leaked out, right? Is it a problem with actually making the product that falls in that cost to make category? No reasonable gross margin at the given market price? In other words, when we make it, we just out of the gate, we're just making it. It costs us more than the price we can get for it in the market, right? And if so, is it a raw material cost issue? Is it a yield or a waste issue? Is the problem problematic with regards to delivery? Maybe we make the product and at the end of the production line, it's got good gross margin and it seems like it should be profitable, right? But by the time we get it to the customer, we're losing on it, right? Because it's perishable or it's fragile or it's hazardous, and we eat up a whole bunch of other costs that we tend to not include in the cost to make, but certainly they're related to that particular product, right? Maybe it's not a product cost issue at all, but instead it's a customer terms issue, right? Maybe the product should be performing fine, but the way we chase this particular piece of business with this particular client, we're just losing on it, right? Until we go address the terms, the product's never going to be profitable, and you're never going to squeeze enough out of the cost to make it a profitable product, right? Did we discount it too much? Is it subject to returns based on all the problems with it? The point is, there are a lot of wrong decisions that could be made anywhere in this organization that I'm talking about, and identifying the right decision is imperative to the start, right? So identifying where in these different parts of the company that product might not be performing is imperative, right? And that's my example of identifying the decision. What decision are we really trying to make here? Step 2 is to gather the relevant data, right? I think most companies have a problem in this area. This McKinsey report certainly points it out. Take a look at the investments that have been made in data-related technologies and compared to their perceived value in the organization. Now, I'm going to take a minute and explain really what you're looking at on this chart, because it grabs me as something that I personally have believed and felt for many years about investments in digital technology. The left column here talks about these respondents are telling you, all right, these are companies, number of respondents who have current investments in digital technologies and the area where they're investing. So accounts payable, accounts receivable, consolidated planning and budgeting, right? Those are high investment areas. Look at the corresponding perceived value from the same respondents in the same companies. Very low perceived value in those investments. You get what I'm seeing here? We're spending all this money, getting all this data, perfecting all these things in an area where somebody in the company is saying, yeah, that's nice for doing that, it's just not of high value to me, right? Look at areas where it is of high. Project performance tracking, that's pretty much online. Scenario management is one that I do a lot of work in, where it's perceived to be of high value. It's got a value of 38 on it, yet only 24 are the people investing in it, right? I'll tell you a real-world example of this, and then maybe you guys can reflect and share with me if you have any similar examples. I have a lot of clients that do what we call cost-based quoting. Is anybody in here, are you part of a business where you actually produce a quote for a product that maybe is custom manufactured or some options are custom tweaked before you win the business? Anybody fall in that category? All right, good, right? I go into companies let me back up. How important is the quoting process? Even if you don't have it in your business, you can imagine. How important is the quoting process in your business? You're an automotive supplier. We can all imagine that, right? You're going to produce a little plastic widget that goes inside of a car, and you're going to sell it to GM and Ford and Toyota, right? And you have to quote that business, and if you get the quote right and you win the business, you're signed up for at least 10 years of production or maybe more, and that's a great win for you, right? How important is it to get the quote right? Very, right? Thank you, whoever said that, right? It's very important to get the quote right, right? I go into organizations all the time that have a state-of-the-art ERP system. Any brand, it doesn't matter. They've invested heavily in it. It's and we sit down to talk about the quoting process, and guess what they log on to? Who said it? Say it louder. You said it, right? $19.95 a month, right? All the quoting you want to do. Arguably the most important part of the whole business cycle. Not really, you got safety, you got to meet quality, you got to get the product out the door and get it to them. But you're going to make it or break it in the quoting process. We've got millions in the state-of-the-art ERP, so it's going to be invested like those 3 light blue boxes on the left. That's where it would fall in. But value to the company, quoting, everybody knows it's of high importance, right? So there tends to be a mismatch in the data that we're gathering and providing decisions relative to the value that we perceive in the organization. And quoting is just one example of it, right? So it sounds like some of you can appreciate that. What else do we meet here? Scenario management I talked about. This is really, I'll come back to a little bit. This is an area where I do probably most of my work. I talked about doing cost and profitability work. If you do that work, what it's mostly about is running different scenarios. Certainly at month end, you want to produce cost reports and run profitability reports. That's easy to do. That's transactional almost in nature. The real value of that is if this changes, what is my cost going to be? If this changes, what's the profitability? And we're going to touch on that again in a minute in some scenario examples, right? But this always fascinates me, the places where we're investing technology and digital efforts versus the perceived value in the company. We got to change this. I don't know what we're going to do. All right, so step 2, gather the relevant data if you can get it. Might be in Excel, but you still got to gather it up, right? Step 3, and this is where we'll talk about some of the scenarios, identify alternatives. Identify the alternatives from which the decision will be chosen. This is where scenario management capabilities really come to pay off. Digital technologies that give you unlimited scenarios with multiple levers are of extremely high value in decision making, right? So here's a typical decision for which these scenarios are valuable, and this is what work that we do day in and day out, right? If resin prices increase 10%, anybody use resin in their business here? right? Am I underestimating it 10% in my example? No, I'm not, right? So if resin prices increase 10% and we're not able to get a price increase from our customers, which products and customers are affected and what's the effect going to be on the P&L, right? That's a very reasonable question for somebody leading an organization to ask when they see every morning when they wake up, crude oil doing what it's doing and resin prices responding, right? Carpet manufacturers, where I do a good bit of work. I'm from Atlanta. We make a lot of carpet down in the southeast. Before we make the carpet, we extrude yarns. All those yarns come out of flake and pellets that we extrude them out of, and resin prices are killing the flooring people, right? They're not able to get the price pass-throughs quick enough to overcome the increase in resin prices, right? Here's another one. What if resin still goes up and we do get a price increase, but then we get a change in demand? Maybe it's because of the increase, maybe it's just because people are buying houses and moving out of the city now, whatever it is, but at the same time, we get the resin price increase, we do get a price increase, and we get a significant change in demand, right? What if those things happen all at once, right? If you think about it, any of the inputs that go into either running a budget or really running a full P&L, if you look at this chart as a real sort of simple attempt at a P&L, what you're doing is you're looking at volume and mix. That's the planned demand across the top blue row, right? Volume and mix, what are we going to make? What are we going to sell? What are we going to deliver, right? Whatever that is, that's my volume and mix. That's how we start a budgeting cycle. What are our recipes and bombs, really product costs? What's our cost to make the thing, right? And our processes and our routings. What are our raw material prices, things that I don't make that I have to go buy and consume? And then what are my selling prices, right? That I can sell the thing for to all my different customers, right? Those are the big buckets of inputs. And there's labor crewing, which really goes into, kind of the BOM and routing green line item. But these are things that go into building up the cost, and then with the blue line at the bottom, the revenue, and give me a little P&L, right? So if I have the ability to pull any of those levers, say, well, what if this goes up, but this goes down, or this goes up, and this goes up? What if we're all going up, right? Then it's a capacity issue perhaps, and I'm cherry picking customers and orders. If you're lucky to get in that position, at least short term, that can be some good margin optimization for you. But the ability to basically change these inputs and re-roll all of that cost structure, and I'm talking about recalculate when I say re-roll, right? Hit a button, recalculate, re-roll from the bottom up. Oh, if that happens, here's the new cost structure, here's the new revenue to correspond to it, and here's the potential profit from it, right? The ability to do that allows you to identify alternatives, which is one of the keys to the success, right? It was key number 3 was being able to identify all the alternatives, right? So we run these day in and day out for companies and help them understand, hey, if this happens, this is likely what it's going to look like. And again, the output of these are the data that's the output is what feeds into the decision matrix we're going to talk about more in a minute. All right, got some good nods. That makes sense to everybody? That kind of re-rolling product cost? How many of you are in traditional manufacturing companies where this kind of budgeting, bombs and routings, and then selling prices come in? Good number of you? That's what it looked like from the pre-registrations, which tended me to go this way. Hopefully those online are as well. Some of you that are in ancillary businesses, it might not be exactly this way, but I think you'll appreciate it. In fact, here's a different type of business that we'll talk about for step number 4. Step 4, if you remember, was weigh the evidence. We said earlier companies don't have the right data to make the decisions, so it's kind of hard to get to this step when you get by it. But nonetheless, you have to do what you can to compare the data points that you do have and try to attempt to separate the facts from the opinions, right? In an example like this one, we use a water flow P&L to show the likely outcomes of 2 different scenarios, right? So here are 2 different scenarios of business, but we're just presenting it in a different way to sort of show in the different areas. Is it revenue? Is it cost of goods sold? Is it in my delivery area? What are the different effects for those different levers that I pulled earlier, right? And this one I like because graphically it shows up, hey, we're going to have this reduction in revenue, but we had a larger reduction in cost, so overall margin, we're better off this way. And the lack of revenue didn't scare me before I ran this quite as bad as it would have if I just heard it was lack of revenue, right? Another typical example that I'll give you is a make versus buy decision for a key component of a finished good, right? So I work with a lot of companies that make highly engineered products, and they're always redesigning, and they get something all down pat. It's a little mini widget that goes inside their bigger widget. Think like iRobot, right? It's a good client of mine that I always think they're making fascinating problems. You know the Roomba that runs around and vacuums and now it avoids things on the floor. They're getting all sophisticated with their new ads. If you haven't seen them, they're pretty clever. but they will perfect a collection of products into a component, and when they get it down pat, they'll take that whole thing and send it out to somebody to make it for them. Say, hey, we want this component, so we just take it in as a component, right? So they're making that classic make-buy decision. And it affects things all in those different boxes, because it affects my sourcing, it certainly affects my cost to make, sometimes it affects my cost to deliver on inbound, depending on how I can get it in and where I have to get it. Maybe I'm even using a subcontractor to make it and then send it to another subcontractor to put it in the main assembly. So it can affect all of those different boxes that we talked about. And if you're not able to measure not just one, but the effect of all of them changing at once, that's a very tough decision to make. Classic make-buy is a tough one anyway, right? Because if nothing else, and if you're a manufacturer, you'll appreciate this, as soon as you go to buy, did you stop and recalculate everything that was left behind in the plant with the fixed cost structure, right? No, most people don't, right? No, that's just, we're already making those, we've already got a cost for those. But as soon as you pull that production and send it somewhere else, you're going to affect everything that was left behind in that plant if you're still operating the plant and making other products there, right? So if you're not moving other volume in there to offset it, you got to not focus on the thing that we're trying to make the decision about, make buy, but say, hey, wait a minute, this is really the decision that we're making, right? And broaden it. So weighing all the evidence is step number 4, and hopefully that's some good examples for you. Step number 5, do something. What'd Teddy say? Right? Even if it's wrong, it's the second best thing you could do, right? So choose among the alternatives, right? Make the decision. Try to understand not only the risk of each alternative, but the risk of no decision or the risk of a delayed decision. If you're not weighing that in as one of the factors, then you're missing out. If you just focus on it in a vacuum. There are these risk metrics that I got down in a rabbit hole on that I don't want to talk a whole lot about. They come into effect really, really heavily when you're doing financial risk modeling. There are all these things that compare sort of, they have probabilities or likelihoods of occurrence compared on a matrix with the impact to the organization, high impact, medium impact, low impact, and high probability, low probability. But you can really get wrapped around the axle, in my opinion here, right? If you gather the right evidence and you're faced with as many facts as you can, given the data you have, just make the decision. That's the value. And I'll show you why it's a value. Look at this chart right here. This is something that was surprising to me when I went down this path. Timing with the decision can be as important as the decision itself. There's a point in time during any decision process where data gathering begins to be of less value than actually making the decision. And like most data points, it falls within a Bell distribution, right? So what you can do is, if you see these two curves, the shorter the time it takes you, so if you can narrow the base of that bell curve, that shortens the time and it pushes the value higher, right? So the one that's filled out with the green and the gray, the increasing knowledge versus the best time to make the decision, the decrease of benefit, imagine you could do all that, but in that narrow curve that's just to the left of it, right? See the increase in value, right? But to do that, you had to gather all the data quicker, right? And get it? You had to weigh all, you had to know what all the alternatives were, right? And compare all those. So how do you get that narrower curve is with a good decision-making process in place. So when it's a time to make a decision, we know exactly what to do. We get in the conference room. We know what our 7 steps are. We line them out. We start sticking stickies around. We start yelling at each other, and we make a decision, right? Speed is a value in this, right? But this doesn't mean shoot from the hip. Everything below the center point of that curve, you could be reacting too early and not making the prime decision, right? So it's a classic Bell distribution on the time you could spend it. But the faster we can inform the process with data, the faster the decision can be made, and then the higher the value. That was a good one to me. All right, step 7, review the decision outcomes and the results, right? So we made the decision, we stuck to it. It's been a few months now. Let's go back and measure it. Did we make the right decision? The truth is, most decisions that we make in organizations, there are some exceptions, you have a chance to modify them, right? Tweak them slightly left, slightly right, or just pull it back. Say, man, we did that. It was the wrong thing to do. The quicker we can identify that by measuring it and jump back into our decision-making cycle to correct it, the more value it's going to be, right? Just because we did it doesn't mean it's right. Doesn't mean we should ignore it and just act like it was right. That's what we tend to do, right? No, we decided that. We even had a process for it, right? This ability to measure it, throw it back into the process, and reevaluate it is the final step of having a really mature decision-making process. Does that make sense? It's no fun to measure, right? We spend enough time, pulled our hair out trying to make the decision. How do we go back and measure it now and go through all that pain again? That's not fun. Decision-making frameworks. I talked about these earlier. As part of the process, you need to employ a decision-making matrix. The matrix will help you assign the right actions, responsibilities, and resources to the decision that's being made. A typical matrix separates things into really two big categories. Internally influenced decisions, separated from those that are externally influenced outside the organization. And then the other separation is things that are big decisions, high risk, high value, versus low risk, low value decisions, right? Just by saying that, you know which ones you want to put the right resources to and you don't want to put too much resources to, right? That's why it's important, because we talked about making the decision at the right point in the organization, not overloading it, involving too many people, not underloading it. Having a decision qualify into one of these quadrants, and then having some rules. So, oh, it's that kind of decision, here's how we make that decision, right? Oh, it's that one, we better go do this, because it's going to be of a different importance level, right? Here are a few real-world examples that I'm going to tell you about that I think fall into these. We'll start with strategy. Anybody in here from Ohio? Some Ohioans. What's going on exciting manufacturing investment-wise in Ohio? Putting you on the spot. Intel. Here you go. Those of you who didn't hear, Intel has announced they're building a new semiconductor manufacturing plant that's going to break ground, phase one, at a mere $20 billion investment. Plan to grow to $100 billion in 7 years after that gets live, right? Who made that decision? How was it driven, right? I'm going to suggest to you that was a strategy, top left quadrant decision that was made. Certainly, we have to know, they haven't said this out loud, it was driven by external forces. Everybody agree with that? Anybody following the semiconductor shortage? Lack of products, like cars sitting around without chips in them, all this other kind of stuff. Somebody in a room said, not again, right? We got to make this investment. We got to get control over the supply chain. That was a great example to me of a strategy driven by external market forces. Does it require planning, right? I can't imagine the time they even chose just to pick Ohio, where to put it, right? I mean, it took a lot of time, a lot of planning, and it's certainly going to reshape that organization, right? I'm fortunate I get to call them a customer of mine. I've done costing work with Intel for many years, so I love them. I was excited to see it. And one day I'll be in Ohio in a plant, hopefully doing some work, so I'm excited by that. Let's move to the next tactic. Tactics, right? You could argue what kind of goes into this. These are things that are driven by external forces, so we're reacting to them. They're reactionary in nature, but they don't have a tremendous impact or value on the business, right? I'll give you a couple examples that I think that fall into this. Touch-free pizza delivery. Who in here knew that your pizza was being touched before the pandemic? I got really uncomfortable with my first touch-free pizza ad that I saw on TV. I just didn't like it. I didn't like it at all, right? That's something that's externally market driven, curbside pickup. That one I liked. That got pretty convenient at a time, especially when we had this senior student in the house that I told you about earlier. So curbside pickup, just to get out of the house, we'd fight over who was going to go do the pickup just to get out. Again, not a big change in the business. I don't think that changed Domino's pizza business dramatically, right? Maybe some packaging. They got new funny cars. They got new insulated things they would leave for you and pick up later. But it wasn't big, but it was some tactical responding to external market forces to keep the operations going decisions that were made. So tactics, ton of vision. Vision is more around things like mergers and acquisitions. That's what mostly falls into this. They're internally focused. We've got a strategic mission. We're going to grow. We're going to get market share. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. So mergers and acquisitions tend to come out of this bottom left quadrant. They certainly are big, high risk, high value decisions that are made, so proper resources go to them, right? But they are certainly internally driven, right? Now, you could argue, hey, the external market with the prices in the market and the consolidation, that's what's driving it, but it's an internal decision that's being made. You're not responding to anything, usually with mergers and acquisitions, right? And the primary objective is to obtain an internal goal of yours, right? Not meet something that the market's demanding of you, right? And then finally, our favorite transactions. Remember the AP/AR where we spent all the money? Right? Internal, we decided to do it ourselves, right? Maybe a customer complained about our process and forced us to do it, but that's probably not likely. We forced it on ourselves, we did it, and of what value was it, right? Relatively small value, didn't change the core of the business. We're still going to build a new box plant, even though AR, AP, whether they're automated or not, we're building a new box plant somewhere, right? Big decisions. So this kind of matrix, and there's others if you go look for it. This was a good one to me as it applied to manufacturing and distribution companies, but there are others that are out there that you can go find that but they all come in something about this. And the key to these, really, any of them that you find, is that it boxes everything into you need to identify what's the value risk. Is it high or low? And that way you're given the right resources, not overloading or underloading it. And is it externally driven? And are we recognizing that we're doing the right thing, or is it internally driven, right? And then you assign the right people, the right resources to it, right? How are we doing on time? So you're not waving at me yet, right? Final thoughts. This is from the same thing I talked about with Gartner earlier. When the process is at its best, this is what Gartner says it should look like. It's connected. You've got the right data and inform the decision. It's contextual. You know what the decision is that we're trying to make. What are the expected outcomes? We know what the alternatives were, the risk versus the value. And then finally, it's continuous. We're measuring it, and then we're throwing it back in the loop and going at it again, right? So we are going, I assume most people are going to lunch after this, right? No other sessions between now and lunch, right? Lunch is later, so there is another one. So I have to change what I was going to give us as our assignment to make a decision on. I was going to say, where are we going to go for lunch? Maybe what we're going to do is we're going to decide, are we going to the next session, or are we going to an early lunch out by the pool? Anybody want to walk us through that decision, right? We could go back and weigh the pros and cons. I think all the evidence is gathered immediately, right? Look outside, look at the pool. Can anybody else see the pool from their room? I don't like a room where I can see the pool. I thought it'd be nice, but now I'm like, why am I not down there and I'm up here in the room doing this call? So that's not good. So, all right, so let's decide we're going to go to the next session, then go to lunch, or else Sue will be mad at me if I suggest we play hooky. Right? All right. Final thoughts. Better decisions, better results. You need the data. You need a decision-making process to feed it. It's well documented. Companies that have a defined decision-making process will outperform their competitors, right? This is something you could take back, hopefully institute if you don't have it in place already. Whether it's on internal focus, reducing cost, external focus, chasing revenue, it's all about profitability at the end. And I think if you focus on those things and take back nothing else other than, hey, can we put this process in place? You should be better off for having sat through the hour. At least you got the CP credits, the very least. Thank you guys very much. Thanks for your participation. And I guess we'll take some questions if we have any. Is that right? We take thoughts and comments also. I prefer them actually.
All right, so the first question is...
Oh, we got people submitting remotely. All right, everybody listen up. I may need your help.
Technology, hold on a second. Come on. All right. So the first question is, there's a lot of analytic work that goes on in costing teams that drive decisions across the company. Can you share some examples of FP&A and costing teams that work together?
I can share some examples of FP&A and costing teams working together, although I'm going to tell you before I do is that they don't do it enough, right? I will tell you something that I see that happens all the time is that the costing team puts all this energy and effort into building what they think the unit cost, the projected standard cost for a product is they're going to make next period, right? And then they give that to the FP&A people. And guess what? The first thing the FP&A people do is they change the volume and mix. Anybody else respond, skin like crawling like me when I say that, right? They never come back and say, oh, by the way, we changed the volume and mix. What do you think the new unit cost is going to be, right? They take the unit cost and flex it against it. There are lots of opportunities for FP&A and costing teams to work together. I think that it has happened more naturally in the last 5 years because of centralization of these teams, right? When I first got into this, I never did cost work without going to the plant. Never went to headquarters and talked about costing. Anybody else appreciate that or have that opinion, right? I went, and guess what? I'd show up, there'd be a plant cost person, big enough plant, you had a controller, then a cost person, and then excitingly, there'd be 3 IEs sitting there waiting to talk about cost, right? That's how I started my career. That's not today, right? Now I go to a big building that most of the people in the room, they might have been to a plant, they might not have been to the plant, but it's the centralized costing team, right? So although that has its disadvantages, putting everybody together, bringing that function from the plants into a central organization where FP&A tends to live already, right, has given me plenty of examples of where they're working closely together. Yep. Anybody else? Thoughts on that? It's a good question.
Alrighty. So our second question is, what's been your experience when it comes to the evolution of decision making inside an organization? Do the most successful companies focus on one area at a time or take an all-in approach?
That's a good question, and I think that I'm not qualified to answer that, right? I don't know, to be honest, what the best methods for implementing this process are, and I certainly don't have the evidence of how people have succeeded. The McKinsey report that talked about the act of making decisions with urgency is a very good one, so I'd reflect you there. One of my other footnotes, if you get a copy of this, if you look, I've got the references in the footnotes of all the slides. One of them was a Harvard Business School paper that I took some of the numbers out of, and it's referenced in the PowerPoint. They had some other good information on growing and maturing your decision-making process, right? So I'd refer you there. I don't really have good evidence on how to best implement it or to mature it once it's started. I really don't know. But that was my disclosure at the beginning, if you remember.
Okay, so our third question is, in the example of working from home, how do you keep people engaged and collaborating in a state of change? My company is going through a lot of change and have brought people back. However, we are now getting the kickback.
We're getting the what?
Kickback.
The kickback? Yeah. Maybe that means they're going back again or back remote again. Listen, I do not have an answer for how you get efficiency out of remote work, which was the first part of that question. Everybody else kind of hear it that way, right? Again, like the people that were the early Zoom investors, if I had that silver bullet, I love you guys, but I might not be standing here. That getting efficiency out of that remote work, there's a lot of work going on studying it right now. I mean, for me and my organization, but I'm a different organization than a lot of you, it's about the people. You either have the right people or you don't, right? That's what it came down to, and they're doing it. You know, they're doing it. I've always had this view. The people that are showing up and doing that job are doing the level of performance they're doing for themselves first and the organization second. Does that make sense? Right? Now, they're coming there for the organization, don't get me wrong, but they're showing up with the level of intensity and professionalism for themselves first because that's what they're satisfied doing, and then the organization hopefully that. So those are, to me, the right people, right? They're doing it because they want to be there and they know it's the right thing to do. So if you have the right people, we transitioned fairly well. I'm not going to claim we had, well, I can't claim because I did it myself. We do not have 100% efficiency. I know even myself, if I'm not there at the office, I just tend to pay attention to things that I wouldn't pay attention to otherwise, and I don't have the same level of efficiency perhaps, right? But my hours have broadened, it seems. Anybody else have your hours broadened, right? I think on the whole, this damn company is getting more out of me. I got to investigate this because it feels nice at like 2 o'clock to go do something that I need to do at 2 o'clock in the middle of the day because they're not open at 6 o'clock, right? But then that same day at 8:30 I'm doing, I don't know, I got to add it all up. I know I had these breaks during the day, that's what happens with me, but I think they're getting more out of me than less. That's my personal experience. Everybody else is nodding along, you think the same thing? Yeah. Do you know when that started? Worst invention ever for those of us who like to get away from work, the notebook computer. That's when it started. I tie everything back to when I got a notebook, right? And I couldn't power it off. Who does that anymore? I'd power it off and leave that big tower under my desk at the office. That doesn't happen anymore.
All right, so the next question actually has 3 questions. So I'm going to try to get all of them answered here.
They better pay extra.
Why are all cost discussions about cost reduction? Is the first one. So if you want to answer a quick response.
That's a good question. I, early in my career, tried to build a business on cost increasing in manufacturing, and we didn't get very far, and I'm making a joke about it, but it's a very good question. Why, I mean, anybody else answer that? Yeah, answer it, go for it. Oh, you can underspend on a lot of things. You can underspend on raw materials, quality, everything, processes, materials, yeah. That you can... That's right. Yeah, I think the answer to that is because of 2 competing things. One is the company wants to make larger margins, and the buyers of our products want to pay less. And those are 2 opposing forces that are pushing on each other. And cost just happens to be I don't know what you call it, that gets beat on because of those 2 forces. That's what I think. But it absolutely could be we're asking the wrong question. What do you think the right question is? All right, go for it.
Okay, how can companies shift the discussion to cost optimization? That was the other question.
Yep.
And then it connects to profit maximization requires optimization instead of blind efforts at reduction. So how do we shift to cost structures and optimization?
Yeah, I want to thank Steve for his 3 questions. I think those are great questions. I don't know how to shift that conversation, right? I mean, Steve, you do a lot of good work in this area. Maybe you want to provide some insight for us. The shift in the conversation is what needs to happen, right?
I guarantee you, everybody in this room, if you're a costing person, you're going to be hammered over the next 12 to whatever the foreseeable future is about how do we reduce costs.
Well, we saw it, right? 10% or more. We saw in the survey, 10% or more. That's a lot of money.
But if you listen to our first speaker,
Yep,
what's happening? Every salary you got is going up.
that's right.
Okay? All your cost structure has supply chain. I'm sorry. I thought I was being loud enough. Everything you've got's got supply chain issues. Everything is pushing up. So if we try to answer that question by focusing on cost reduction, what that means is we're getting in the back of the line in the supply chain because our supplier, he's optimizing his profits.
That's right.
So we have to shift the conversation to more a total cost picture. What are we going to spend in training? Your point earlier, sir. What are we going to spend in quality? What are we going to spend that by spending money, we get an optimized cost. We get a best total cost. Emerson Electric, one of the best cost producing companies in the world, focused on total producer cost. They didn't focus on being the lowest cost production. They wanted to be the best cost production, which meant if I spend more to get a better product that the customer will pay for, that's a more optimized solution for the customer, and they'll pay more for that. So we've got to upgrade our sophistication as costing people to look at the whole picture, not just at pure reduction. Anybody can see the invoice cost a few pennies less. What you can't see is the vendor's bad quality. What you can't see is the vendor who doesn't deliver on time.
Yep.
What you can't see is the vendor who doesn't provide services. The biggest thing in distribution right now is value-added distribution,
Yep.
where it's not just shipping a box, but it's warehousing, it's moving, it's the whole logistics around the whole thing. So we've got to up our game into more optimized total cost picture, which means we change, instead of looking at invoice pricing, we look at the cost structure. The biggest part I love, Matthew, you didn't get into any of this. Everything up there is a cost structure.
That's right.
Our real estate costs are going down because we don't have to, what is the cost of a guy working from home or a lady working from home? It's cheaper than having to buy an office for it. Now, we've got a bunch of office leases we're going to have to offload and convert that instead of being expenses into something productive or negotiate our way out of them. But we have to look at our total cost structure and make sure that total picture is optimized and give us a better answer that way. But it's going to require us all as management accountants to up our game. We got to become a whole lot more strategic and say, what are we going to do to change the strategic value that our company provides, as opposed to just looking. If you're just looking at pennies reduction, I can call me afterwards. I'll take any of your costs to zero. I'll take 100% of the cost out of your business. I guarantee you I can except environmental liability. I haven't figured out how to get rid of that yet. But
That's
I can
right.
take all the costs out of your business. Unfortunately,
right.
none of you will have a job, and your business won't last very long because all those costs are investments.
That's
so
right.
until you figure out what the value of that cost is, our job is really figuring out the value in relation to the cost. And our tools weren't set up to do that. That's the conversion we've got to make, is being better focused at the value that we provide instead of just looking at the cost number.
Yeah, that's phenomenal, Steve. Good job.
Thanks, Steve. Alrighty, with that, our next question is, you identified 4 areas of costing during the presentation and talked about the improvements of each. But is there one area that is most important than the others, or one place companies usually start?
I don't think there's one place that's more important. Steve just made a good point, right? It's the holistic view. So whether it's sourcing, making, delivery cost, or cost of sales terms, negotiations, those kind of, all of them have equal importance, and at different stages in the organization and different states of the market, they're going to take different levels of priority, right? If you're a mature Manufacturing company, cost to make is probably pretty well tapped out, and you're not going to chase a lot there. You're going to get better optimized, but you're not going to go find it, right? If you're that same big mature manufacturing company, raw material prices, supplier costing, you're not going to squeeze a lot out there because you've done all that, right? You spent decades doing that. It depends on where you are in your company's maturity and your overall cost maturity, right? So no, I don't think you can put any one of those boxes as important or over another at all. Depends on the company.
Okay. So how do you perform change management in driving the costs down? Usually there is a lot of resistance to doing things differently or find alternative sourcing. So
yeah. I think the time right now is ripe for that kind of change. People are disrupted, right? I've seen companies make decisions right now that I bet they wouldn't have made 5 years ago, right? Just pull the trigger on things because they're like, hey, everything's out the window, right? So disruptive times are a good time to initiate and force change through, right? Because we're changing things anyway. Other than that, I don't really know. I don't have a great, I don't have good time. I don't know relative to the timing of it. I don't know.
okay, so our next question is, what's the one place companies are most likely to stumble when they take on costing projects as part of their decision-making and digital transformation?
Well, leave out digital transformation at the end because that can be quite holistic, but in the area of the cost management, it's not being holistic enough, a little bit like Steve said, right? Focusing on one area as a cost reduction initiative is just, it's missing the picture. A holistic view of cost optimization, right? With the goal of cost reduction perhaps, or just recognized value and we don't want to reduce it any further, but a holistic view is the key. Right? Don't focus or silo on one area. Number one, the area feels like they're getting picked on, right? Just to pull costs out of one area, that's a zero-sum game.
Okay, so I'm gonna just ask one more last question here. We'll do another question. How do you account for qualitative inputs into make or buy other areas of the decision matrix? And there's an example, single sourcing a component with vendor that could have their own disruption outside control.
Yeah, so I think that goes into part of the risk criteria that we talked just a little bit about, right? So typically the lowest cost alternative, if you're talking about something like a supplier of a component or a raw material, typically the absolute lowest cost isn't the lowest risk, right? Or it has more risk is what I'm saying, right? Pinning yourself to one vendor, giving them all the volume just to get the list, presents more risk than if you spent a little bit more and spread that risk out a little bit, right? So the first part was how do you get the qualitative data? I think you measure the risk. You assign risk values to more than just the low cost, right? But assign risk values to it in decision making, right?
Okay, with that, I would like to thank Mahat for an excellent job here.
Yep.
And attendees, make sure you scan your badge as you're leaving out and fill out the survey evaluation for your feedback.
If you allow me, just quickly, we're an exhibitor here, so I have a booth that I'll be hanging out for the next couple of days at. I have Ian and Rima and Stacy, which are my colleagues and cost nuts like myself that'll be in that booth along with me. So stop by, visit us. They have some good giveaways. If nothing else, you can take home. But thanks for having me. Thank you, Sue, for having me.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks.
something I like, a little something I've been wanting to borrow. Tonight's the night, come on, surrender. I won't lead your love astray, astray, yeah. Your love's a weapon, give your body some direction, that's my aim. Then we could take back the night. Come on, use me up until there's nothing left. Take back the night. Dizzy, spinning, sweating, you can't catch your breath. Take back the night. Ooh, don't know when the sun is rising next. Take back the night. So if the feeling's right, then raise your glass and let's take back the night. Take back the night. They gon' try to shut us down, but I'll be damned if we gon' let them take back the night. Take back the night. Ooh, you know you gon' mess around and find out there ain't no one better. Take back the night. Yeah. Rare, there's not too many. No one but you in crowded rooms. We can do anything. Attraction can drive you crazy, and the way you're moving, you go crazy. That's incentive for me. Wanna do something right, yeah, but we could do something better. There ain't no time like tonight, and we ain't tryna save it for later. We stay out here living the life. Nobody cares who we are tomorrow. And you got that little something I like, a little something I've been wanting to borrow. Tonight's the night, come on, surrender. I won't lead your love astray, astray, yeah. Your love's a weapon, give your body some direction, that's my aim. Then we could take back the night. Come on, use me up until there's nothing left. Take back the night. Dizzy, spinning, sweating, you can't catch your breath. Take back the night. Ooh, don't know when the sun is rising next. Take back the night. So if the feeling's right, then raise your glass and let's take back the night. Take back the night. They gon' try to shut us down, but I'll be damned if we gon' let them take back the night. Take back the night. Ooh, you know you gon' mess around and find out there ain't no one better. Take back the night. Break it down. Break it down. Yeah, yeah. And the horn say, alright. And the horn say.